Good afternoon. I'm sorry I couldn't be with you today in person, but I am unwell. But I wanted to make sure you got your lecture from week 11. Okay. So today we're going to talk about measurement, and we're going to also talk a little bit about validity and reliability. So measurement is the way that we measure in research when we're looking at a survey, or if you're looking at qualitative research, you're looking at how qualitative work is done. I recommended that you take a look at this link right here. Okay, it doesn't want to open. This is a really good site that really explains a lot of stuff about research, and it talks about different types of surveys, the questionnaire, the interview. It talks about how to select a survey method. So it's a lot of things about developing a survey, which we're going to talk about probably more on Wednesday. How to word questions, how to do question placement. So those are all things that we're going to cover on Wednesday. So I'd like you to definitely look over this site. The link obviously is in Blackboard. I got to get back now. So we're in week 11, which means there's not that many weeks to go. So today we're going to talk about reliability and validity. So make sure for Wednesday you just take a look at this website right here. So I'm going to try to open up PowerPoint. Okay. So sometimes when you are looking at the way data is collected, you can see that it's collected in different ways. And this has to do with quantitative data. And you will find that there's nominal data, which are things like place of birth. It can be race, ethnicity. It can be anything that's just a name. So you don't have it doesn't have a number associated with. You can also look at data that's ordinal, which can be like a Likert scale. Rate this from 1 to 5 on how much you agree with a certain topic. There's also interval data, which can be salary or anything that's a number that you can scale. An interval data might also be, for example, on a depression scale, if the mean score is 30 as opposed to the mean score being 45. So whenever you collect data, there's different levels of measurement. So here it talks about nominal. Just think about nominal sounds like name, so it's something that has a name to it. And ordinal, again, is when you're thinking about a Likert scale. Interval, the distance between the attributes does have meaning. What that means is that that you can compute the average if you need to. So you can say the average salary or the average number of children. And then a ratio might be something where it can be the number of clients, the number of symptoms, things like that. So there is an absolute zero to it. Now, reliability and validity is something you hear a lot about research, and oftentimes when you're reading a research article, you will read about the reliability of an instrument. So the reliability is how consistent a measure is, which means how well it measures the same thing, the same time. Where validity is more of how good the measure is, how strong it is. I'm not going to cover that slide. So here I think is an awesome example of how to understand the difference between reliability and validity. So imagine this target here is what you're trying to measure. So, and all these little blue spots are the measurement points. So let's just say we're measuring depression. And so right here, this red dot is exactly the perfect measure of depression. So as you can see, when we surveyed, say there's 20 dots here, we surveyed 20 people. And here are all their answers. So you can see that they're answering all within the same area, so that the instrument is very reliable in that it gets you the same results. However, it doesn't measure what it's supposed to measure, which makes it not valid. So this next target here, it goes around, it has that, it has the proximity of the dot, which is where you want to measure, but it's not measuring all like in the same area like here. So it's attempting to measure this dot, but it's not doing it in a way that's coming together. So it is a valid measure in that it is trying to measure what you're trying to measure, but it's not reliable in that it doesn't give you the same results. So this is something it's neither, giving you a nice spread around the dot, and it's not measuring in a clump, so it's not reliable or valid. This target is both reliable in that all the measures within a certain point, and it's valid in that it's measuring right around the point. So there's different ways of looking at reliability. So oftentimes when you're reading a research article, it'll give you a Cronbach alpha score. Now, Cronbach alpha is a way of measuring reliability, and it's just simply done through the computer. So this just quickly, I'll go over some of the ways that they look at reliability. So the reason why you look at reliability is, let's say you want to develop an instrument to survey people about how happy they are about being a social work major. So you develop a bunch of questions to see how happy they are. So then you have to test your questions to make sure they actually measure happiness in the social work program. So you would run a bunch of tests on your measure to see if it was reliable. So one way to test reliability is to look at inter-rater or inter-observer reliability. So basically you give the test to different people and you try to see whether or not it's measuring similarly. Retest reliability is very conservative, but it's also the one that you see most often. And when I do research, I often use retest reliability, where you give your measure, so let's give our happiness measure to the class, and then 2 weeks later I'm going to give the same happiness measure to the class. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to see how much the scores from test 1 correlates with test 2. So I want to know whether or not you test the same way within 2 weeks' time to see if that measure is actually reliable and that it will measure the same things in 2 separate sittings. There's other little tricky ways of doing it, where you can take a bunch of questions that are from the same measure and you can just give them in 2 different versions. And you can also do this complicated internal consistency reliability. This basically is a mathematical way of looking at the different items within the scale. Now when I say items in a scale, what I mean is all the different questions. So let's say our happiness scale had 10 questions in it. So that would be item 1, item 2, all the way down to 10. And so we'd want to see which questions in our scale correlated with one another. So if I said one of the questions was, I feel happy today, and another question was, I always feel happy, we want to see whether or not those things are answered the same way by most people. So that's how you look at a correlation. This is just another way of doing it, where you divide the measure into 2 sets and then see how much they correlate with each other. So here we are to Cronbach alpha. So basically when I do a Cronbach alpha on a measure that I'm developing, you just take you give the survey. So, for example, for my veteran adjustment to college survey, I gave the measure to 95 veterans, and then they answered all 13 questions in my measure, and then I just take that data and I run a computation in SPSS, which is the computer program that I use to do these things. And then it just tells me what the Cronbach alpha is. And oftentimes in a study, you'll see Cronbach alpha is point whatever. Now, it's important to know how to interpret a Cronbach alpha so that when you're reading research, you know whether or not the instrument that you're using is very reliable in the study that it's being done on, and also in the studies that's been done prior. So if you have a Cronbach alpha of 0.7, if it's a beginning model, if it's a beginning survey, that's okay. But really, you need to see a reliability coefficient of 0.8 or higher. So anything over 0.8 is fine. So I'm sure when you were doing your data extraction, you came across, it said Cronbach alpha is 0.86 or 0.92. So basically what that means is it's all the items, all the questions that are within that survey are all highly correlated with one another, and therefore the instrument measures what it's supposed to measure. So that's reliability. Let's move on to validity. So remember in the target, so validity is, does the measure actually capture the construct we are trying to measure? So if we were measuring depression, does the scale actually measure depression? So there's different ways of looking at validity. So this is a big chart that talks about content validity, criterion validity, and construct validity. So when you use words like validity in research, you have to make sure that you're actually talking about scientific validity. So you can't just say in a paper that this study was valid or this survey results were valid, because validity is something that is used in a very specific way. So the definition of content validity is the extent to which the content of the test matches what it was supposed to measure. So this is from an educational perspective. If a semester or quarter exam that only includes content covering during the last 6 weeks is not a valid measure because it doesn't measure the whole semester. So imagine I give you a test, and I want to make sure that the test covers everything we've done up until from September on, but I only give the test on material that I've covered in the last 6 weeks. It is not a valid measure because it doesn't measure all the content. So that's what content validity is. It has to cover all the material that is required. So back to our example with depression. Now there's different aspects of depression, like a low appetite, for example, and not feeling like you want to get out of bed in the morning. So those are different items that might be on a depression scale. And if I don't include all those items, I'm missing some of the content. And if I'm missing them, that means that there's an issue with content validity. So the next is criterion validity. This is the extent in which the scores in the test are in agreement with or predict what the concept is. So, for example, in this testing example, because I think it's easier to understand, if you have an end-of-the-year math test, does it correlate with what everyone's doing on a state level? So if you have your depression scale that you're looking at, does it correlate with other depression scales that you've done? So let's say you make up your own depression scale, and then you also give the people in your study, for example, Beck's depression inventory. Does your scale correlate with Beck's scale? So that's kind of thing. When people make up their own scales, they often have to look at these kind of validity issues. The other one is construct, and that means that it's the extent in which it corresponds with other variables that are theoretical. So this is kind of more of a theoretical thing. So the example here is if you have English as a second language students, you can hypothesize that they're not going to perform the same as people that are English speaking originally. Okay, so so that's looking at the construct validity. Other types of validity is face validity. So when you're looking at a measure, you're looking at a scale, does it look like it's covering all the stuff in the construct? So let's go back to our happiness scale. So let's say we have 3 items. You're happy today. Are you happy most days? Are you happy with your major? If you're just looking at this 3-item scale, this 3-question scale, does it seem like it measures happiness in a social work program? So when you're looking at content validity, let's just make a checklist to see how relevant all these issues are to what we're trying to measure. So if we ask how people are doing happy today, is that something that's relevant to what we're trying to measure, which is happiness? Other sort of ways of looking at validity, and these are all criterion related, is does the measure predict something that it's supposed to predict? So if I give you a scale about happiness and you take the scale, is that scale likely to predict that you will actually be happy? Does it measure well against other measures? So if we have our happiness scale, let's look at another scale to see if our data that we've gathered on our scale correlates with the data on another happiness scale. So for example, when I did my dissertation, I had a scale on adjustment. My scale I developed was on the adjustment to college. And so I needed to measure with a concurrent validity with a student stress scale, which was an established scale, and also an adjustment scale, a military adjustment scale. So I was able to compare my scale that I developed, my instrument, against instruments that were already developed. So this is looking again is, does this scale measure what it's supposed to measure? That's basically what validity is. So you might see in research articles they're talking about convergent validity, which is it theoretically similar to other measures? And also, is it not similar? So let's say I have a happiness scale. I want to compare it against a depression scale to make sure that they're completely different. Okay, so if we were to make a measure, we would measure a 10-item measure on the end of semester stress. Now, if I was in the classroom with you, I would ask you to sit down with a pair, with a buddy, and develop a 10-item measure based on end of the semester stress. So what I'd like you to do now is find a partner and develop a 10-item measure so that's 10 questions that will help us determine whether someone has end of the semester stress. So you can work in pairs or you can work in group of 3s. So develop your measure, and then when I'm in, hopefully I'll be well enough on Wednesday, we'll present these to the class and we'll talk about measurement design and how to test it. So we're going to test for content validity. We're going to look at criterion validity. We're going to look at construct validity. So your task right now is to get a partner and write 10 questions that you think would measure the construct. And the construct is end of the semester stress, which I think some of you might be somewhat familiar with. That's all I have for now. So if you guys can work on that project and then have it ready for me on Wednesday, I would really appreciate it.